What if I told you that in less than 6 minutes, parts of an entire coastline were erased? Not damaged, not simply flooded, but wiped away as if they had never existed. On March 11th, 2011, Japan experienced something that didn't just shake buildings, it moved the ocean itself. And what followed wasn't just an earthquake, it was a wall of water so powerful that it tore through cities, swallowed neighborhoods, and dragged entire communities inland. But the most terrifying part of this story is not even the tsunami itself, because the real disaster actually began long before the water ever arrived. Japan is one of the most earthquake-prone countries on Earth. It sits along the Pacific Ring of Fire, where enormous tectonic plates push, scrape, and dive beneath one another beneath the ocean. For centuries, earthquakes and tsunamis have shaped the country's coastline, its architecture, and its memory. Japan knows disasters. It studies them. It prepares for them. It builds for them. Seawalls line much of the northeastern coast. Warning systems monitor the Pacific. Evacuation signs point toward higher ground. School children practice what to do if the sea suddenly rises. In many ways, Japan in 2011 was considered one of the most disaster-prepared nations on Earth. And that is what makes what happened next so horrifying. Because the question was never whether Japan expected earthquakes. It did. The question was whether Japan had prepared for an earthquake and tsunami this large. And the answer would come on a cold Friday afternoon in March. 2 days earlier, on March 9th, a powerful earthquake had already struck off the coast of northeastern Japan. It measured around magnitude 7.4, strong enough to be felt across the region, strong enough to trigger a tsunami advisory, strong enough to make people pay attention. But after the shaking stopped and the waves remained relatively small, life continued. Trains ran, schools opened, offices filled. Fishing boats went back to the sea. There was no way for most people to know that the earthquake on March 9th had not been the main event. It had been a warning, a foreshock. The earth had begun to move, but the rupture that would change Japan was still waiting offshore. March 11th, 2011, Friday afternoon. At 2:46 p.m. local time, deep beneath the Pacific Ocean east of Japan, the fault finally breaks. The rupture begins off the coast of the Tohoku region. Then it races along the boundary where the Pacific Plate is being forced beneath the plate carrying northern Japan. Not for a few miles, not for one town, but across an enormous offshore region hundreds of kilometers long. The seafloor lurches. In some places, the fault slips by more than 50 meters. An almost unimaginable amount of movement, enough to shove a vast section of ocean upward and outward. The earthquake is later measured at magnitude 9.1, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan, one of the strongest ever measured anywhere on Earth. But in those first seconds, no one is thinking about magnitude. They are thinking about survival. In Sendai, in Ishinomaki, in Kesanuma, in towns all along the northeastern coast, the ground begins to shake. At first it is a jolt, then a roll, then something far worse. Buildings sway, roads ripple, office towers move like trees in the wind. Inside homes, shelves empty themselves, cabinets fly open, glass explodes. People drop to the floor and hold on. In Tokyo, hundreds of kilometers from the epicenter, skyscrapers bend slowly from side to side. Trains stop, elevators halt. Workers pour into streets and plazas, looking up at buildings that seem to breathe. But closer to the coast, the shaking is more violent. The ground will not settle. It goes on for minute after minute. 1 minute, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5. Nearly 6 minutes of movement, long enough for fear to become disbelief. Long enough for people to wonder whether the shaking will ever stop. Long enough for the land itself to change. Along parts of Japan's northeastern coastline, the ground sinks, leaving coastal communities even more exposed to what is already forming offshore. Because while buildings are still swaying and aftershocks are already beginning, the ocean has started moving. The earthquake has lifted and displaced an enormous volume of seawater. A tsunami is now spreading outward from the rupture zone, and the first warnings begin to sound. Japan's systems react quickly. Television broadcasts interrupt programming. Sirens wail in coastal towns. Mobile alerts are sent. Officials issue tsunami warnings. People are told to evacuate, move inland, get to higher ground, do not wait. But the first estimates of the tsunami's size are too low. At first, some warnings suggest waves of around 3 meters in certain areas. Then the estimates rise, 6 meters, 10 meters, higher. But by then, in some communities, the ocean is already arriving. And what is coming is not a wave in the way most people imagine one. It is not a clean blue crest curling onto a beach. It is the sea itself, rising and advancing, black with mud, heavy with timber, cars, fishing boats, roofs, and everything else it has already torn loose. In places, it reaches the coast within roughly half an hour of the earthquake. For some people, that is enough time to run. For others, it is not. In the city of Kamaishi, towering seawalls had been built to protect the harbor from tsunamis. They were among the largest in the world, concrete barriers designed to hold back the Pacific. For years, they stood as symbols of preparedness. But on March 11th, the sea rises higher. The tsunami pours over them, crashes through them, moves past them. A structure built to stop the ocean becomes a temporary obstacle, nothing more. And beyond it, people are still trying to escape. That is the central tragedy of this disaster. Japan was prepared, but it had prepared around assumptions. Assumptions about how high the water might rise, assumptions about which areas were safe, assumptions about how much protection seawalls could provide. On March 11th, the tsunami breaks those assumptions apart. In the flat coastal plains around Sendai, the disaster is captured from the air. A black tide pushes inland across farmland, roads, and neighborhoods. Cars turn around and race away from it. Some make it, others are overtaken. Houses vanish one by one beneath the moving water. Greenhouses collapse, fields disappear. Boats that belong in harbors are carried across roads and into towns. From above, the tsunami does not look fast at first, but that is an illusion. It is moving with relentless force, swallowing everything that cannot get out of its way. People flee in cars, on foot, up staircases, onto rooftops, into schools, into evacuation buildings. Some watch from high ground as the places they grew up disappear below them. The wave reaches far inland. Across a coastline stretching for more than 1,000 kilometers, communities are hit one after another. Miyako, Otsuchi, Rikuzentakata, Minami-san-riku, Kesenuma, Ishinomaki, Natori, Namie, Soma, towns whose names will become permanently tied to the disaster. In Rikuzentakata, the tsunami tears through the city with extraordinary force. Homes are ripped from foundations. Roads vanish beneath debris. Public buildings are overwhelmed. By the time the water retreats, much of the city is gone. One pine tree remains standing along the shoreline, later becoming a symbol of survival in a landscape where almost everything else has been destroyed. In Minami-san-riku, the tsunami crashes through the town center. The water reaches the disaster prevention building, where local officials had continued broadcasting evacuation warnings until the final moments. Many of them do not survive. The building itself is left as a shattered steel skeleton, surrounded by emptiness. The people inside had spent their last minutes trying to save others. In Kesenuma, the tsunami sweeps through the port and city streets. Fishing boats are carried inland. Fuel tanks are damaged. Fires break out. Flames burn through areas already buried in water and debris. Once again, the disaster changes shape. Earthquake, then tsunami, then fire. A town hit from every direction at once. But perhaps nowhere does the tragedy reveal itself more painfully than in places where people believed they had reached safety. In coastal Japan, evacuation centers had been designated in advance. Schools, community halls, multi-story buildings. Locations thought to be high enough or strong enough. Many saved lives, but some did not. In certain areas, the water reached evacuation sites that were never expected to flood. People who had done what they were told, who had run to the places marked safe, found that the tsunami was larger than the plans built around it. That may be the most terrifying thing about March 11th. Not that people failed to prepare, but that some preparations failed them. At Okawa Elementary School in Ishinomaki, children and staff had survived the earthquake. The school building stood. The shaking ended, but confusion followed. Where should they go? Was the school safe? Should they climb the nearby hill? Should they move somewhere else? Minutes passed, the tsunami arrived, 74 students and 10 staff members were killed. It would later become one of the most painful and scrutinized tragedies of the entire disaster, because the earthquake had not killed them. The delay had, the uncertainty had, the failure to act fast enough in the face of a danger that was larger than expected had. Across Japan's northeastern coast, thousands of stories like this unfold in different forms. People stop to collect belongings. People return for elderly relatives. Workers stay at posts too long. Emergency personnel continue broadcasting warnings. Parents race toward schools. Children search for parents. In a tsunami, love can become a reason to run toward danger. And in 2011, that instinct cost lives. The official toll would eventually rise to more than 15,000 confirmed deaths, with more than 2,500 people still listed as missing. Most victims are killed by the tsunami, not by buildings collapsing, not by the earthquake shaking itself, by water. But the tragedy on the coast is still not the end of the disaster, because in Fukushima Prefecture, the tsunami is moving toward a nuclear power plant. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station sits on the coast. When the earthquake strikes, the operating reactors shut down automatically as designed. That part works, but even after a reactor shuts down, it still needs cooling. Emergency diesel generators are supposed to keep power flowing to the pumps that remove heat. For a brief period, the system appears to be functioning. Then the tsunami arrives. The wave that hits the site is far higher than the plant's design assumptions. Water floods the grounds. Emergency generators are disabled. Electrical systems fail. Cooling systems are lost. The plant enters what is known as a station blackout, and suddenly, Japan is facing a third disaster. In the hours and days that follow, temperatures rise inside the reactor cores. Fuel is damaged, hydrogen builds up. Explosions tear through reactor buildings. Images of the blasts are broadcast around the world. Residents are evacuated from surrounding areas. Confusion grows. Rumors spread. Officials struggle to explain a crisis unfolding in real time. The earthquake had shaken Japan. The tsunami had shattered its coast. Now, Fukushima turns a national disaster into an international emergency. And this is where the opening truth finally reveals itself. The real disaster began long before the water arrived. It began in the belief that past tsunamis defined the limits of future ones. It began in seawalls built for waves that were smaller than the one that came. It began in evacuation plans based on maps that did not imagine the water traveling so far inland. It began in a nuclear plant whose defenses were not designed for the tsunami that struck it. Nature delivered the blow, but the scale of the catastrophe was shaped by what people believed was possible, and in 2011, what happened exceeded those beliefs. The tsunami leaves destruction along a vast section of Japan's Pacific coast. Entire towns are reduced to foundations and debris. More than 120,000 homes are completely destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people are forced from their homes. Roads, railways, ports, schools, hospitals, and fishing fleets are damaged or wiped out. The economic cost becomes one of the highest ever recorded for a natural disaster. But numbers alone do not explain what the disaster looked like. It looked like families searching evacuation lists taped to walls. It looked like shoes lined up outside shelters. It looked like photographs recovered from mud and hung up so survivors might find their memories again. It looked like empty neighborhoods where only concrete slabs remained. It looked like towns waiting years to decide whether rebuilding in the same place was even safe. Some communities rebuild behind higher seawalls. Others move homes to elevated ground. Some schools are rebuilt. Others remain memorials. Roads are raised. Coastal forests are replanted. Tsunami evacuation towers are built. Warning systems are revised. Japan studies every failure, every delay, every place the water crossed a line planners thought it could not cross. Because the country knows it will face earthquakes again. It will face tsunamis again. The goal is not to pretend the risk can be erased. The goal is to survive the next one better. The 2011 disaster also changes the world's understanding of megathrust earthquakes. Before the earthquake, some scientists did not expect the Tohoku region to produce a rupture of this size. Afterward, hazard models are re-examined around the world. Could other subduction zones produce larger earthquakes than previously thought? Could other coastlines face tsunamis beyond existing maps? Could other communities be protected by systems that work beautifully right up until the day they do not? Japan becomes a warning not because it was careless, but because it was prepared and still overwhelmed. That is what makes the story so unsettling. If a country that studied tsunamis for generations could be caught off guard by the scale of one, then every coastline has to ask the same question. What are we underestimating? The earthquake lasted nearly 6 minutes. The tsunami struck within minutes more. The Fukushima crisis unfolded over days. But the consequences have lasted for years. Families were separated, communities were relocated, coastlines were rebuilt. Some survivors never returned home, some missing were never found. And every March 11th at 2:46 in the afternoon, Japan stops to remember the moment the ground began to move. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami was not just one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded. It was a disaster that exposed the limits of preparation. It showed that warning systems matter, evacuation matters, engineering matters. But so does humility, because nature is not required to stay within the boundaries of our expectations. On March 11, 2011, Japan had seawalls. It had sirens. It had maps. It had drills. And still, the ocean came farther than people believed it could. It crossed roads. It crossed fields. It crossed rooftops. It crossed the lines between preparation and catastrophe. What if I told you that in less than 6 minutes, parts of an entire coastline were erased? That was not a metaphor. It happened. And the reason this disaster still matters is not only because of what Japan lost. It is because of what the world learned too late. The most dangerous disasters are not always the ones no one sees coming. Sometimes they are the ones people think they have already planned for. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. These stories take time to research, write, and edit, and every single view, like, and comment helps keep them going. So, if you want to see more documentaries like this, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely makes a difference. And to everyone already supporting the channel, whether you have been here from the start or just found it recently, thank you. You are the reason these stories get told. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.